So a scientist finds himself the last man on Earth after a plague turns everyone into vampires. If this sounds familiar, this is because this story has been used multiple times. And this week, we're going to talk about the original I Am Legend by Richard Matheson, which the rest of the series is based on. And before we kind of go into the different things we talk about as usual, I thought maybe one thing that would be an interesting question is, what is it about the last man on Earth kind of idea that like really strikes us? What does it for you, I guess, Dan?
Well, I mean, I've been thinking about this because we've been doing quite a lot of movies about doom and gloom and the end of the world and zombies and stuff. And for me, I think it was looking at the start of us having nuclear weapons and this, this being used in warfare, kind of got this idea into people's head that we now have the ability to end all life on the planet.
Yeah.
So that makes these kind of stories much more easier to accept and to, I guess, creatively formulate. And I think this idea that you would have had all this preparation that the government would have put out about nuclear testing, and if there's a nuclear war, these are the steps you have to do. So I think it started this whole idea of survival themes. And so, you had to live your day thinking, okay, well, perhaps we should build a bunker in the back garden in case there's a nuclear war. So, and I think this idea of survivalism and survivalists even sort of living off the grid and all this kind of thing, and maybe even distrust in that kind of bled into distrust of the government. I think these kind of themes are pretty much a symptom of the Cold War. So people were kind of preparing themselves mentally for the end of the world on a kind of regular basis. And the Cold War kind of exacerbated that because there was this kind of like threat in the background that was hanging over us that was saying, okay, Russia could go to war with us at any time, so be prepared. And that's why I think where you see the difference in something like a horror movie like Return of the Living Dead, where it's one night and by the end of it, the authorities have kind of got to grips with it. Whereas with Dawn of the Dead, it's the end of the world and you just kind of survive. So these sort of themes have really kind of like got quite elaborate quite quickly and gone to much more extreme sort of measures.
Yeah, I definitely think that, like you said, the theme itself really addresses this dark fantasy, if you will, of where everything's kind of wiped out and stuff like that, and we're the only ones left. And we have to kind of like just somehow survive, and pretty much like kind of it shows up in the whole Mad Max series. It shows up in the course of the zombie series and stuff, and then we have like kind of these more disease-driven ones as well. On the lighter side, I think it's also this fantasy that like you have free reign, like kind of like all of a sudden you can just run through the mall and get anything you want and stuff. And I think that's the other kind of side that like we, as George Romero does it, is like kind of this fantasy of like kind of the other side of materialism, right, where it's carried to that extreme that like okay, now you have everything, what do you do and stuff.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think it's definitely this sort of isolation, but the fact that there's like one person left makes you as the audience identify with that one person.
Right.
And they're like the only character that you can identify with. Everyone else is purposefully sort of like adapted to the environment, and they're the last one that isn't, which is kind of like what Mad Max is really, as well as all of these movies as well. But yeah.
So I guess we'll start in this time with the first one, Last Man on Earth, with Vincent Price. It's an interesting one, right? Where certainly Vincent Price is really known for these the Hammer House horror films and stuff like that, and he's kind of really known in the roles where he's lamenting like kind of some lost love and all that, and certainly like that's the things that really capitalize on, with him in this version and stuff. This is, of course, the earliest version. And I think one interesting comment that the author, Richard Matheson, had himself was, I don't understand why they didn't just kind of make things more true to the original story. And here we have a version that, like, they tried to do as much as they, could, that was like, because they did have vampires and stuff. to the extent that like they even had like mirrors and garlic and driving stakes to the heart, that kind of thing, stuff like that. The tropes, if you will, of vampire movies and everything. But what worked for you? What didn't?
Well, I mean, it's the problem with, I mean, I guess I Am Legend. I did actually start reading it as well because I had it on my bookshelf. I've been meaning to read it for a while. And I mean, there's so much kind of inner dialogue and inner thoughts in the character that he goes through in his isolation and loneliness that it's quite difficult to portray all that on screen. And I mean, what I liked about, what I found pretty funny with The Last Man on Earth is isolation would be very boring, and the movie is remarkably boring in the first 20 to 30 minutes. I mean, there is a lot of garlic procurement and lathe work, making steaks and checking the generator, and I mean, to me, even the vampires seem pretty bored. They're just sort of like, just sort of shouting his name and kind of gently patting his windows to try and get in. And it was just that in itself made me quite amused. And then after about half an hour, I got bored and started just Googling about Vincent Price, I think. But it is quite close to the novel in what actually happens if you look at it in events. But I mean, the highlight for me was really jazz and vampires. The fact that he was there getting drunk, listening to jazz while vampires were kind of coming for him. That was, I don't often see jazz and vampires mixed in a movie. I mean, just the fact that he was able to sort of bat them away with the hand mirror and sort of slowly walk through them. They just seemed like a minor annoyance than anything that was actually terrifying. But yeah, after that, I'll be honest with you, I kind of lost track with the movie.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it was most accurate because of the fact that like it's at a house, like a regular home and stuff like that. It's not some elaborate setups, which we'll get into with the other versions. And Richard Matheson wrote it as the story was set in his home in Gardena, which is like a pretty suburban place. So that's pretty much where we're the setting of this one, as opposed to the other ones where they're more of a city environment and stuff like that. So that is like an accurate reflection. The thing that like also I think is interesting is how there's more of the idea of the vampirism and stuff like that, and where but not in the sense of like, in fact, that's one thing that like kind of changes over is like these are more like zombie like vampires and stuff, and that's something that like apparently what was interesting about that is that like Romero really based Night of the Living Dead more on that idea and stuff, and so it's something that kind of, like you said, it seems pretty lethargic in this version, but yet it's something that like Romero decided to kind of take into his, which really of course like kind of launch like kind of where the whole zombie genre took off in a different direction from what it was before. So I thought that was an interesting kind of aspect of that.
Yeah, I mean, for me, the theme that really ties all three movies together and is really the core of it is this idea of systems of belief, because and one person being isolated from it or judging another group of people based on a particular system of belief. Because in this one, they, even though they are vampires, they're kind of zombie-like. They're not sort of monsters really in some respects in the original one, and they can talk and things like this. So they're sentient. So there's this idea that there is some sort of intelligence to them and some sort of rational behavior, but it's just outside of what we can really deal with in terms of living our normal human lives. And I mean, we go into the Omega Man, they kind of adapted that slightly, I would say, to generational beliefs.
Right.
Charlton Heston representing, the sort of rational, sort of powerful white guy with lots of money against like the sort of the hippie youth, which is very sort of heavily hammered home with the Woodstock images in the beginning. And then in the Will Smith one, they do another slight twist on it in that it's a mixture of science versus faith. And that's for me, the strongest theme in that one. It's like he represents somewhat the sort of very rational science, and Anna is very much the faith-based person. And that's the kind of, the way they juxtapose those two. But yeah.
I think in the Omega Man, what we really see is that the Titan is the sense of that people screwed up as the establishment. And like you said, the youth is really, features as like kind of the future and stuff. They're the ones who survived. And, with the cure that Neville, comes up with, the serum with his blood and everything like that, then that's like seen as like kind of the future and stuff. I thought it was interesting how like one of the earliest scenes is him sitting in theater watching Woodstock, and they're talking about just this idea about like kind of like kind of let's all get along, and and basically how what's really amplified is the fact that like we didn't get along, we destroyed the earth and stuff, and and we being the establishment and stuff, the older generation and stuff like that, and whereas here like is the new generation kind of they're going to basically start over, and I think there was even a mention at some point about like in Eden and stuff. I thought that was like also another interesting like reference.
Yeah, I think it was between him and is it Ruth, the girl who was afterwards?
It was either Ruth or there's also the young guy, and I have to forget the guy's name.
Yeah, it's different because they changed the names in the different rooms, but no, definitely there was a mention of that. There's also this scene later on when he's about to go and kind of fight them, and he's driving an army jeep, wearing an army hat, got a machine gun, and the guy, the sort of young survivors are saying, "Hey, man, you're pretty hostile." It's like it was kind of very sort of obvious they were trying to say, "Okay, older generation, newer generation." At that point,
definitely, so. Yeah. I mean, it was that, and basically, like he's. This is kind of like you said in this military uniform, stuff like that, and I think that's again like just the science establishment. I thought what was also interesting, whereas the other ones was more about the disease and vampirism and like kind of the others being like kind of these creatures and stuff. In the Omega Man, now we had like the family, and that's like kind of this cult reference to, of course, the Mansons. And you're either with us and part of the family, or you're kind of like some vile something that needs to be destroyed and stuff like that. And it really definitely like the time period, of course, that totally makes sense that was like really on people's minds and stuff. And this is of course way before the recent revisiting of that with Once Upon a Time in Hollywood.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's what sort of got it to maybe this sort of theme of belief systems. Because obviously they're showing that, if you believe in something like the Manson family, you follow that without following some sort of dogmatic way of thinking, it's very dangerous. But likewise, Charlton Heston's character is so stuck in the past that he's pretty dangerous, and he's mowing down quite a lot of these people. He's almost just as dangerous as they are in a way. So that was kind of what I got from that.
The other theme I thought was interesting, it kind of runs through them, and you kind of mentioned it a little bit, is this idea of like, we as human beings see ourselves as like kind of the top of the ape or the apex of, the food chain and stuff like that. That's inverted where, humans are the food and stuff like that. And the original story, of course, that's like kind of what we see is like kind of that once they get rid of, Neville, then in fact, these creatures are the dominant species and stuff. And I think that's something that like is carried out in like not necessarily even in these stories, but like in the Terminator series, that's also something that like kind of is covered again. That like, well, maybe at some point with all this technology and stuff, technology will in fact become the dominant species and stuff, and then we'll be like we'll be subjugated to being food / chattel and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, I would say the thing that the Omega Man brings in that was a theme that wasn't in the first one was this idea of, like you said, okay, you would survive this and you'd be able to go in and drive a Ferrari and go into any store and get what you like. But there's this, the idea that capitalism and wealth becomes meaningless in this world, because there's lots of scenes that he's got all this nice stuff in his house. I mean, he even has a quite amazing costume at one point, which is a green velvet jacket with a puffy shirt, and pulls, for some reason, 10 sausages out of the fridge. And he's going to, as a doctor, you should really know better than that. But he's kind of going around a hotel that's got cobwebs all over it, and and even the hotels, there's just kind of corpses in them. And I think that they really sort of started with that theme. And then in I Am Legend, they go even bigger with nature overrunning Times Square. So it's like, you know, all your greedy capitalism, look what it's done to us now. Now nature's taken things back and run the city. And that was I don't know, for me, that was what got introduced in that one.
Yeah, there was also that one scene in the Mega Man specifically where I think it was like an armored car that like was turned over, and you just see these piles of cash, and you know, he just kind of doesn't even, you know, glance at it. And that was, of course, like kind of just, you know, just a total, you know, I thought that was like one of the strongest images of that idea that, like, you know, money is meaningless, right? When
when there's no one to spend it.
Yeah.
Well, they did the same in I Am Legend as well. He walks into a corridor when he's trying to chase Sam in there. There's, you know, he's obviously backing away from all of the sort of zombie vampires, I should say, in the corner, and there's just like cash all over the floor. But yeah, it's that was obviously one of the bigger themes in it.
So the other thing with specifically I Am Legend, which is interesting now, like that it's the one so far that they actually use the title. Like, so that's probably one of the first things that's like is striking and stuff like that. And then meanwhile, it's the one that's the of course the most modern, that like they, you know, really set it to a very contemporary theme. And then of course, you know, Neville now is like kind of one of the most contemporary stars. You know, Will Smith like kind of being, you know, almost like in his heyday at that point and stuff like that. And so, you know, here we have like an African American who's these scientists and stuff like that, whereas the other ones, of course, were, you know, basically the Caucasian scientists and stuff like that. So I thought that was an interesting kind of twist to make it even more updated.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was also this idea, and I have this idea that, you know, it was a cure for cancer that caused this. Actually, you know, they're actually kind of saying in a way as well this idea that cancer is a force of nature, much like the nature that's sort of overrunning the city. And it's funny because there's some people from the medical insurance and other things, they say that we may actually never find a cure for cancer. It may just be so inherently built into the structure of life and DNA that, you know, trying to cure it is not possible. But in this, they're saying it will create a zombie apocalypse. Well, whatever, take your pick. But you know, and I have to say, like, that opening scene with Emma Thompson is like one of those things where, like, with an English accent, you can, for some reason, Hollywood thinks gives you a license, or can make like the most terrible dialogue sound plausible, where the newsreader's sort of saying, so in effect then, what you're saying is what, you cured cancer? She's like going, yeah, I suppose we cured cancer. Yeah. It's just like, what? It's just awful dialogue. But that was my main criticism with the Will Smith one. The dialogue was just so boring most of the time, and they had some real opportunities to do something interesting. I thought the whole idea halfway through, when he gets trapped by the vampires, I thought that was actually going to be a turning point in the movie, where they would have said, okay, these things you viewed as monsters are actually sentient, and it would have done a little bit more of what the Omega Man did, which was kind of say there was a culture that's just very alien that you don't understand. But it was just kind of mildly hinted at, and was just used as a vehicle to change his sort of situation about halfway through the movie. I mean, that was what I liked about the Omega Man, is they played more on this idea. They actually gave them a voice and a culture and everything else. And they also worked into the themes of prejudice with the Omega Man, in that, you know, the reason they were after Neville was because he didn't bear the marks, the physical marks, which is kind of goes into this idea that, you know, you're judging people by their appearance, which I thought was quite nice to see. The other thing I thought, which was really kind of quite bizarre for me in the Omega Man, was the interracial relationship, which you certainly don't get in any of the others. And if you kind of look at it in snapshots, you have bare-chested Charlton Heston chasing a black woman with a machine gun, and then they're kind of like kissing, and then she turns white. So if you look at it in snapshots like that, it's a very kind of weird, you could see it in what, I'm still working on what they were intending with that, but it was interesting to see. But they didn't sort of repeat that with any of the other, with the Will Smith one.
And that's also something else that's like very much dated, is because at that time, you know, you still had a lot of the whole, you know, Black Panther thing and stuff. And so it's an interesting kind of thing of where each film like is a time capsule in a way of you know, like kind of the different times that they were made and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And you know, like the Will Smith one being where at that time I think we're kind of post, you know, 9/11, where if anything, I'm surprised that didn't get into more of like a terrorism kind of theme again and stuff. Instead of like kind of just focused more on this cure and stuff and everything. I think to me, it had the best in terms of production value, where it seemed like, you know, like here you can really, well, you not only picture a city being vacant and stuff, but it really kind of, you know, had these sweeping kind of shots where you saw everything in that way.
Yeah.
And so I'm sure it was not easy to kind of to do that, like kind of.
Yeah, I mean, definitely they would have to close some pretty expensive roads.
Yeah.
And, I mean, they would have done in Omega Man as well, but not quite to the extent of I imagined. But, yeah.
I guess that's a reflection of the different film budgets, right? Where, you know, like kind of, it's no doubt like kind of the most expensive. Well, it was definitely the most expensive out of the ones.
But it was just a shame that the CGI was just so bad.
Yes, that's the one thing that I just cannot get over. After all this build up, you get to the point, you finally see the creatures, you had all this anticipation, and it's like, really?
Yeah, it's just so terrible. And the shame of it is that actually, I think Will Smith actually does a pretty good job in portraying fear and sort of.
Oh yeah.
And actually, the isolation bit he does pretty well. My only real complaint with that was that part of what's nice about, from what I, at least the bit of what I read from the novel, is that they don't try and make you like Neville as a character too much. In his loneliness and isolation, it kind of highlights that when there's no one else to see what you're doing, you let your standards slip. You're going to be pretty, you know, bad about your health. You're going to drink too much, smoke too much, and think pretty bad things. And they made Will Smith, I mean, this is a lot of things in the 90s, is they so wanted you to like the main characters in the movie that they just put in all these kind of formulaic things like, oh, he's petting a dog and he's coy and he likes Shrek and everything else. It's like, oh, give me a break, man. He's been alone for years on end. By now he'd be hairy, alcoholic. He'd probably be, you know, have teeth falling out. You know, it's just.
Yeah. I mean, the closest thing they came to that was just basically having him snap, you know, like kind of when, you know, the gal made breakfast and like, you know, he was saving, what was it, the bacon? He was saving the bacon, so he snapped, like kind of, you know, like, I'm saving that, like kind of, and so that's the closest attempt they had to make him kind of somewhat antisocial. But I think the problem is that, like, you know, this is Will Smith, right? So they, you know, kind of, they wanted to really leverage the whole save the dog moments, like, you know, like save the dog. I'm kind of referencing like kind of this guy called D. Snyder, I think it was, or kind of. But anyways, his thing or Blake Snyder, sorry, where his thing was that, like, one of the things you have to have, an element you have to have in a story is to have a hero that's likable. And so one of the ways you do it is to have him save a cat. Like, you know, he's based that idea on Superman, right? The original movie. One of the things that he does, like kind of, you know, after he gets to Earth and he's kind of has all these powers and stuff, is he goes up and, you know, like when he's starting to kind of, you know, save everybody, he stops for a moment to save this cat for this little girl, like and so it's just one of those things that kind of like to make somebody a hero, you have to have this kind of save the cat moment and stuff is what Blake Snyder said in his kind of thesis, if you will, for screenwriting.
It's a very, very simplistic way of doing it, though. That's my complaint. It's like, you know, you look at True Grit, she just shoots a rat in the first 20 minutes. You still like her as a character. It's much more interesting to do that and be a likable character afterwards.
Right.
So. Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby to get ourselves a treat.
Yeah, but I mean, I guess the one thing we haven't sort of talked about yet is the religious themes in it, because they get very heavy in the Omega Man and even heavier in I Am Legend. In Omega Man, he is portrayed twice as being on a crucifix,
right?
And at the end of the day, he's kind of also his blood. It's like the blood sacrifice that as well. It doesn't actually save people, but there is kind of like him bleeding to death in a sort of a crucifix form. on at the end. Now with I Am Legend, it's even more heavy-handed in that they put on the fridge he's a savior right at the beginning. They've got well, he's again, it's his blood that he has to kind of pass on to save people. There's also the butterfly that he sees at the end, which is a Christian symbol of resurrection. And if you look at when we talked earlier about systems of belief, Anna's very religious, and she believes there is this place that you can be saved. Yeah. No, there's no, I'm a scientist, there's no place you can be saved. And he sort of burns in hell at the bottom of his basement, and she finds the gates of of heaven, more or less, and is saved over there. So it's kind of very, very heavy-handed religious themes, in my opinion, in the Will Smith version.
Yeah, I think one thing worth mentioning is how it's interesting in the original theatrical version. He is sacrificed for this kind of saving the world and stuff like that. And then there was an alternate version, an alternate ending where he ends up like kind of going with Anna and stuff like that, because somehow he sees the butterfly imprint on the glass and realizes that he needs to give back one of the creatures that he was captured and stuff, that he did manage to kind of help to cure a little bit and stuff like that. And I guess that's like one of those like kind of Hollywood choices that was interesting, that like they just absolutely had to like kind of make sure Will Smith survived in that version and stuff. And and that was like just one of those kind of strange things that they did both versions and stuff like that, and then ultimately still decided on the sacrifice for the original release.
Yeah, I think the sacrifice is definitely, of those two choices anyway, is a better ending.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things. There's actually quite a lot of interesting themes in I Am Legend, but it's just, I don't know, just doesn't really come together that well, in my opinion. But
in terms of the this idea, I think we talked a little bit about it, but like basically, I feel like that's another thing, is this idea of tampering with nature. You're going to pay the price, so to speak. Like that one's made very clear with the Will Smith version, where like we tried to find a cure for cancer, and then we end up creating this worse disease, because initially it's like kind of we see like in that the newsreels and whatever, that like all these people are cured and everything like that, and then it kind of quickly turns to flipping, where like, oh well, actually we kind of now all these people are sick, and we don't know why, stuff like that. So I think that's like kind of another kind of theme I think that runs through these, is that like which Omega Man kind of changes to like we actually literally destroy ourselves, but then like in the I Am Legend with the Will Smith is like kind of the idea that like we undo ourselves by trying to find something that we're not meant to find or something. I think it's that idea.
Yeah. I think as well, there's also this sort of foreshadowing of the people turning into creatures at the start of the Will Smith one, with this sort of herd of deer running through, and then it's the vampires are running through later on. But you could almost say that if the point of the Omega Man is that there are these two sort of social groups that don't really understand each other, you could say perhaps they're sort of alluding to that we are so disconnected from nature that us sort of tampering with it is another, that's the system, and they're sort of comparing perhaps.
And I think what's striking is, with having, like kind of the animals running through the city and stuff like that, is that like, we can, it's this idea that we can,
ultimately
mess around, we can kind of screw things up for ourselves, but then nature's going to come back. Ultimately, that's what's going to, still be here long after, we're dead. In fact, I think it's like this, I don't know about trope, but it's like kind of, we sometimes it's a joke, I guess, of like, long after we nuke ourselves, the cockroaches will still be roaming the earth and stuff.
Absolutely. Well, I can tell you from living in a place where
Oh no.
you tried various forms of poison and other things, the cockroaches do keep coming back regardless.
And boy, they are some huge ones. I know that. Like I
Yeah.
was born in like a tropical environment. It seems like that's these tropical places. That's where they really thrive.
Oh God, yes. Yeah, it's horrendous. But anyway, yeah. So if you could improve any one of the three movies, how do you think you would improve it?
I think with I Am Legend, absolutely, like kind of just like have better CGI. I mean, that's like the simple
Yeah,
kind of
that's the
thing that
simple
like
one here.
like there's a lot of things that like it's definitely not a perfect movie, but it's to me like the strongest one out of the different ones, and it's that's the one thing that like kind of to me like I just like really like you went all this distance with everything else,
Yeah.
you spend all this money on everything else, and then this is where you fall short. Like kind of it's like they might as well have had like Shrek or something like that. It would have been looked more realistic or something.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it was that you could have done CGI better. The dialogue could have been just a huge amount better. I think as well, this idea of giving the vampires more of a sentience and some sort of motivation, reason, perhaps, or some sort of other thing other than just to eat people would have been, I don't know. I think there's something they could have done there that made it more interesting, because this twist was sort of with the trap was so kind of powerful. They've got the intelligence to move a mannequin, set a tripwire, and do all this and take him hostage, and yet there's no other indications they've had any other rational thought aside from that. It was just a bit of missed opportunity for me. I'm gonna differ from you here. I think the Omega Man was by far the best of the three.
Wow. Okay.
I really enjoyed that, just because one, it was kind of, you can see obviously like Tarantino and Robert Rodriguez must have got some inspiration from that, because it really is just it's kind of quite a fun but albeit bleak kind of pulp kind of movie. And also I just thought Charles Heston driving around in a sports car brandishing a machine gun and having zippy one-liners was much more up my alley. But that was actually one thing that did strike me, actually, just about one-liners, is that they're quite an interesting device in a movie to get the audience to identify with the character. Because he is obviously the last man alive, so all of his one-liners are delivered for the audience.
Right.
Just like, and I've thought about that some more, and I thought, well, actually, James Bond's one-liners are nearly always delivered after he's killed someone.
Yeah.
So kind of like him talking to the audience.
Right.
But yeah, no, it was just, I think just the outfits, especially the music, the soundtrack was fantastic with the Omega Man. And just the whole sort of vibe of it I just enjoyed it a lot more.
The creatures, I have to admit, were probably more terrifying. Kind of having, like as much as like kind of Charlton Heston apparently didn't like the makeup and stuff. I thought like kind of they were more terrifying than the bad CGI. I mean, it just was scary to kind of see these creatures with like kind of the pale eyes and stuff like that. So I thought that was like kind of more effective.
Well, yeah, I mean, it was more kind of like their sort of dogmatic beliefs, and they could be sort of reasoned with, even though they were kind of sentient. It was kind of, I suppose, kind of scary in a way. But they did look a bit, I mean, I don't know why their outfits had to be sparkly. That was a bit sort of weird, but yeah.
Yeah, that was definitely like one of those choices that we can't account for. I don't know if anybody will ever be able to kind of explain that one.
I mean, I think they could have perhaps done a better job of making them a bit creepier, or maybe added a bit more of a horror element to Mega Man to make them a little bit more scary. That would have been better, I think. But,
I thought the lighting was kind of strange too, where it just different times it had this kind of very much made for television kind of lighting feel.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, and it was too bright most of the time, wasn't it?
And I think that was like partially due like from what I understand, the director, that's his background, stuff like that. His came from a television kind of filming background. So I think that's one of those things that like kind of it's really you almost can't get around. It's like kind of if somebody's like kind of comes from a that environment, like kind of where things are lit a certain way, they probably more likely hired lighting people that kind of came from that background also, and on and on. So
yeah, how would you make Last Man on Earth better?
That's a tough one.
That's a tough one. That's probably another whole. You need a movie length set of improvements.
I think Vincent Price, number one, like kind of as much as I love him for everything else, stuff like that, he was just, just not the right man for the role. Like kind of, I kind of kept feeling like at any moment he was going to just basically come out with his kind of, some candles and like, in fact, I think he even had it a few times and stuff like that, and talk about, like kind of, some kind of ritual that he has to kind of perform or something, and more so than a scientist. Like, I mean, his intelligence is believable as a scientist, but I think he has such a strong association with that whole, the Hammer House series that like, I just, really didn't see him as Neville. So in fact, they even called him Morgan. They even changed his name.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Will Smith as a scientist, it was a bit of a stretch for me, but I'm willing to give him a go. I mean, like I said, they just shouldn't have tried. I think it would have been much more interesting had they made his character more realistic and less likable, and it would have been a much more interesting stretch for Will Smith as an actor.
Right.
So I would have liked to have seen that, but yeah.
I mean, I think they kind of did something similar of making him less like the typical hero in was it Hancock. And it just didn't work. Like, I think he's one of those kind of people that, like, he's made, so to speak, for the role of the hero, the likable hero and stuff. And to play him in something else, the only other one that kind of, like, where I think they kind of did they did a good job with him, putting him in a dramatic role, was the one of the Pursuit of Happiness, where he was believable as a guy who was struggling, but again, it was a likable person and stuff like that, a likable hero. So I think like overall, he, like the other person that I think of different times is like Tom Hanks, where, if you play him as a villain or some kind of, psychotic kind of, it just doesn't work,
Nah. Yeah, it's one of those things, isn't it? You always think, I mean, you can understand why actors want to sort of stretch and try different roles and do a thing. I mean, because they don't want to be typecast for one, and they want to try different things. But there must come a point where, you look and say, okay, I'm Chevy Chase. I do this kind of Caddyshack role well. Not so much a serious, dramatic, invisible man. Just doesn't really fly with the audience. Right. So, yeah, it's a difficult one. I guess you can only find out by trying, but yeah.
I mean, there's an SNL skit that like kind of really captures what you just said, because what they do is like basically they have like like Danny DeVito, like kind of auditioning for Star Wars, right? And so he's like kind of so you see this character playing, or this actor playing Danny DeVito playing R2-D2, and you kind of like, it's funny because like it just totally would be how he would play it. Or Al Pacino. I think it was like kind of having him as like kind of in some other role, like kind of like Darth Vader or something like that. And just again, like that's how you would see them. You'd see it as Al Pacino playing this other character. Like I think that's one of the things that just is one of those. Like I said, the actors want to stretch, but I think sometimes it's like whether or not the audience will buy it is like kind of that. That's a tough one.
Yeah, I guess though after you've. I mean, I would say the way to do it, if I was, not that I am really in a position to give star actors any advice, but doing it in smaller independent movies is a more interesting way of doing it.
Oh, yeah.
Because if it doesn't pay off, it's not such a big deal, right? You're not going to embarrass yourself on like a $100 million budget movie, so.
Yeah, and that's apparently why some actors, they do, like James Franco was actually really known for that. He loves, indie films because he finds those as opportunities to kind of stretch himself and everything. So some of these, big name stars, they do, go out of their way to find these kind of roles. And I think that's great. I mean, like I said, it's kind of like lower stakes. So why not, so yeah. And I think, the reality too is that like, as much as one of the things we talk about with these remakes versus original is what is it that like kind of is the point of these, and like kind of when does it work? And I think part of it is that like realistically, as much as we want fresh stories from Hollywood, that they're a business, and so it's understandable that like there's only so much risk that they're not only willing to take, but that they should take, because like kind of whether we actually invest or not. And I guess in a way we are all investors in these films. Like when we buy our ticket, we're basically saying, like kind of voting with our wallets of like kind of, what we want to see, and we're kind of making a statement to these studios and stuff. And so I guess, like kind of in that respect, we only want to some degree them to kind of mess around with our investment so much and stuff.
Yeah, well, or if you're Netflix, they're algorithmically tracking what you're viewing, and then they can use that to decide what original programming might work for certain demographics of people, which is quite a clever way of doing it. I don't know how successful it is, but yeah, I guess we will see how many people keep subscribing to Netflix when Disney Plus and all these other sort of streaming services come out. So,
yeah. I think that's a part of the whole thing too, is that we're a really interesting time of that. Whereas a lot of the older models of like kind of how things are financed, like kind of some of them, like Hollywood still trying to use these methods and everything. But the reality is that like we're at a point of inflection where things are really shifting, and it's hard to say what like kind of will shake out of it. But part of me like kind of pictures that will have like the ability to kind of go to a theater, and at the trailers they'll ask for your vote on like kind of whether you plan to see something in the theaters, where you plan to just wait till Netflix, whether you might buy a copy and stuff like that. And I think having an app to kind of do that can be like one way that like these films and these kind of the studios and stuff like that financing the films can make smarter decisions.
But hopefully the people who are clicking what they like are smart enough to know that their votes are valuable marketing material and get something back for it. So
right, that's another kind of discussion, I think. So.
Yeah, it's a different one. Yeah. So I guess have we covered everything for The Last Man on Earth? Any other things that you wanted to?
Yeah, I can't think of anything else that like really stands out about these. I feel like probably the only other thing I feel like we didn't really so much cover is how like this has become source material for so much. We kind of briefly mentioned it, that like George Romero found a lot of inspiration. I think different times we've just had like kind of even Stephen King, he said right out that like Richard Matheson was always a huge inspiration on his work and stuff. The closest one, as we kind of mentioned it previously, was Cell, where he basically took the apocalyptic perspective by using it with a modern twist of kind of the cell phones kind of turning people into mindless zombies and stuff. So I think that's one of the things that's interesting about this particular property.
So Richard Matheson, am I right in thinking he also did quite a lot of Twilight Zone episodes as well?
Huge.
And I think did he write Duel, which was
I believe so. Yeah.
Movie? Yeah. So he's obviously pretty influential in terms of story writing in general for Hollywood. So.
Yeah, there's some other like kind of things that like he's less known for, but like kind of What Dreams May Come was like the Robin Williams movie about going into the afterlife and stuff. I thought that was a really great one that I'm glad that at least got a decent treatment and stuff. The other one was Somewhere in Time, which is actually one of my personal favorites. It's got the time travel element, and of course it just was really, I thought, really well done just overall as a piece. It's just one of those kind of underrated movies, I think, because of how like there's something about that story that I think is like kind of really just stands out from a whole lot of other ones that are in a similar genre of time travel and stuff.
Iron Maiden wrote an entire album where they wrote one of their albums was called Somewhere in Time.
Oh, interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah. Showing my Iron Maiden fandom there. Also, of course, I just remember that Richard Matheson wrote one of the most sort of iconic Twilight Zone episodes, which is the one of the kind of the gremlin on the wing of the plane when you look out and he's written. No one believes that it's there, which it's very hard. If you watch that, it's very hard not to just sort of look out the window of a plane and think, maybe, but yeah.
All right. Definitely.
So I guess the question is, what's next for our viewers?
So I think some of the ones that we have coming up is, of course, A Star Is Born, which is one of the ones that Dan and I are kind of currently going through. I think some of the other ones that, we've covered quite a bit of sci-fi and horror, and I feel like that's one of the things that, like, it's really hard to avoid with these remake versus original, and I think that's one of the things that we'll continue to kind of find is that, that's just rich territory for these, especially the horror. Like it just, and I guess that's, the only kind of, I don't even know if it's an explanation, but it's just kind of just the way it goes, that like these are movies that I think Hollywood definitely recognized that, like, they're going to get a more likely good return on their investment. They're more likely to make money compared to some of the other ones where, drama and all that, it's kind of like can be very hit or miss. So I think that's one of the things that, like, is interesting, that, like, there's something about horror that, like, just really draws us like flies, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, one that would interest me, because I've been now trawling through lists of remakes, and that was that apparently Barb Wire with Pamela Anderson is a remake of Casablanca.
Whoa.
So, which I did not realize at all.
Right.
And of course, the other surprising sort of remakes is that Battle Beyond the Stars is a remake of The Magnificent Seven.
Interesting.
If you remember, I don't know if you remember that sci-fi movie.
Yeah.
Kind of a late 70s, early 80s.
Yeah.
So there's quite a few kind of quite interesting remakes out there.
Yeah, I think that'd be a worthwhile, topic to cover. Just like some of the most interesting remakes, I guess, that we wouldn't expect and stuff.
But yeah, definitely we'll be doing A Star Is Born. All 10 hours of musical drama have been digested and prepared to be analyzed. So.
And Casino Royale is still definitely one that, like,
yeah.
I feel like at some point we just got to do, like, kind of that just.
Well, I'm a massive fan of James Bond movies, so of course there's also the other one I thought of was Thunderball and Never Say Never Again.
That's an interesting one. I didn't realize the connection there.
Yeah, and that's and the other interesting thing is same actor as well.
Right.
So that's quite good, and it just gives me an excuse to watch James Bond movies. So.
Super. So yeah, we'll definitely keep you all posted. As always, subscribe and so you can stay on top of what we've got covering up next. And so I'm John Chang, and
I'm Dan Evans.
Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.